Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello, good morning. The Prime Minister has said she wants to put Britain at the cutting edge of science and technology, announcing an extra £2 billion of funding and plans for a pro-innovation tax system.
In her first speech to business leaders at the Confederation of British Industry, Theresa May also said businesses need to repair the damage that's been done to their reputation by embracing change.
We all know that in recent years the reputation of business as a whole has been bruised. Trust in business runs at just 35% amongst those in the lowest income brackets. The behaviour of a limited few has damaged the reputation of the many. And fair or not, it is clear that something has to change.
Listening to the Prime Minister was our political correspondent, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, very good morning to you. This is a politician, Theresa May, who can rattle the cage of her audiences. Think back, for instance, to the way she's talked to some delegates at the Police Federation conference before now. She didn't do that today.
No, she didn't, but she did make it clear in that speech that business needs to change, and this is because her overarching message, Colin, as Prime Minister, is essentially trying to understand the reasons for Brexit. Clearly, one of those reasons she is arguing is because trust in business and capitalism is at a low ebb, and that ultimately, yes, government needs to change, but business needs to change as well. And that is why, even though she was demonstrating that as a Conservative Prime Minister, of course she is open to business and that she is open to the markets and to capitalism, she also does think that things do need to change, like, for example, more women on executive boards, and also this idea as well about having workers represented, or their voices represented on boards. And that has caused a little bit of confusion here at the CPI, because when you contrast that with what she did say at the Conservative Party conference last week, there seems to be a slight change in the wording, or at least in the tone, because she said last month, Colin, if I'm Prime Minister, we're going to change that system, and we're going to have not just consumers represented on company boards, but employees as well. Have a listen to what she said just under an hour ago here.
While it's important that the voices of workers and consumers should be represented, I can categorically tell you this is not about mandating works councils or the direct appointment of workers or trade union representatives on boards. Some companies may find that these models work best for them, but there are other routes that use existing board structures, complemented or supplemented by advisory councils or panels, to ensure all those with a stake in the company are properly represented.
And Darren, on corporation tax, there's a genuine fault line, I was going to say opening up, it was already there, but deepening between Labour and the government on corporation tax. Labour calling it essentially a tax perk for big business. I see the Adam Smith has said it's great news, the idea of cutting corporation tax, because it might make British business less sluggish, more productive, but a genuine division opening up there.
Yeah, so as part of this kind of grand bargaining that Theresa May is trying to present to business, so that, yes, they need to change, like, for example, when it comes to workers' representation on boards, she also wants to give them some incentives as well, and that includes a cut in corporation tax. Now, there is a plan to cut down to 17%. That's been welcomed by the CPI. But again, Theresa May reiterated this message this morning that she wants to see, Colin, corporation tax at the lowest level of any major economy. Now, that at the moment sounds absolutely fine. However, we've just had Donald Trump elected to the White House, suggesting that he wants to do the same, potentially have it as low as 15%. So are we potentially going to see a corporation tax war between the United States and Britain? It'll be interesting to see if that plays out. We're not entirely sure whether Downing Street were clear that they're going to get into a race to the bottom on corporation tax. Aside from that, there was also extra investments for some research and development, an extra £2 billion over the next few years in order to help the technology industry in the UK. But ultimately, the big white elephant in the room that she briefly touched on, but with still no more detail, is of course Brexit, Colin. It's what all the business leaders here want to talk about. They want clarity and they want certainty. And Theresa May yet again was failing to provide that, because ultimately, as she says, she does not want to give an ongoing kind of running commentary on negotiations with the European Union, that she wants to stick to the line that she will only talk about things when she's got something to say. But ultimately, That is difficult when these people out here in that hall want to know if Brexit will be pro-business or not.
Darren, thanks a lot. Joined from central London by Steve Smart, who's a Senior Vice President in Space and Defence at the information technology consultant CGI. Steve, very good afternoon to you. Let's just start with that point that the Prime Minister was making about corporation tax. There are those people who feel, certainly from Labour's perspective, that it's a perk, a tax cut for big business. There are lots of other people, certainly at the CBI, who think it's a wonderful thing. Where do you come from?
I think it's a question of balance and making sure that investments are targeted not only on pure research but targeted on things that generate economic wealth for the nation. So I think it's important to get the balance right.
Lots been said, not least by the Prime Minister herself in her conference speech, about the just managing sort of cohort of people out there in the economy who are just managing economically. The sorts of people in the industry which you're speaking for this afternoon are highly skilled, highly educated, and oftentimes highly paid. The research and development money that the Prime Minister is talking about is not going to help those people who are struggling by on average earnings.
Well, I think what's important there is that we focus on technology, we focus on innovation, and we ensure that we lift the whole economy through doing that, through the adoption of new techniques, in particular in my business, in CGI, taking forward new techniques, new innovation, to remove a number of the routine jobs, but actually free up economic wealth in that way.
How dependent is your company, how dependent is your industry on skilled labour from overseas, and to what extent do you fret about the potential impact of Brexit, making it harder for you to get the really skilled people that are, literally doing rocket science?
Well, of course, in the space industry, which is now 59 years old, so since the early 60s, the space industry has thrived on cooperation and collaboration around the world. So the International Space Station in particular is very much sponsored by Europe, but also occupied by China, the US, the UK, and so on. So we very much do focus on bringing together groups of people from around the world in order to deliver the most advanced technology and capabilities going forwards.
But, there's no suggestion you need to be in the European Union to be part of the European Space Agency, though.
Absolutely. The European Space Agency came together. UK was a founding member of that in 1976. We continue to be a member of the European Space Agency. The government contributes to that, and industry provides capability into science projects, telecommunication projects, navigation and Earth observation projects.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, just talking broadly about the space industry in the UK now, because in a sense it's been one of those slightly hidden success stories, hasn't it? I mean, the amount of growth in that particular sector, the export value to the British economy at large, it's worth an awful lot of money.
Yes, it is. The market itself is around about a 12 billion market. It's been growing fairly consistently, about 6% per annum, and enjoys pretty high productivity. So as a sector, certainly a number of different domains, and more importantly, space is an enabling capability for the future. And we look at applications such as GPS, navigation systems, intelligent management systems, and global communication systems. We see it very much as an enabling capability to other sectors.
Yeah. And in terms of providing that kind of employment, I mean, when people are thinking, young people especially, drawn to, space as an area that perhaps is romantic and attractive, but can they be sure they're going to get 40, 45, 50 years of employment in a world where robotics, artificial intelligence, all playing their part?
I have no doubt about that. In fact, space, to a large extent, was one of the forefront technologies in introducing robotics, introducing unmanned aerial vehicles. A satellite is in fact controlled in an automatic way. I guess what I see in the future is innovators, the people that bring together the science, the technology, engineering and mathematics, and put a business acumen on top of that in order to generate the wealth in the future.
And Steve, how do you find other sort of captains of industry at the CBI there. I mean, the sort of traditional industries. How do they view the sector that you're coming from? You know, the space industry. Do they see it as a little bit Johnny-come-lately, a bit flaky, a bit pie in the sky, a bit sci-fi, or do they take it very seriously?
No, I think they take it very seriously through organisations such as the Catapult, where they were able to show direct linkage between the work that we do, creating space-enabled capability into the automotive industry, into agriculture, into aerospace, particularly transportation and so on. So I think there's a genuine belief and desire that we're out of the sci-fi era and very much into capabilities that will improve the infrastructure for the UK and more widely globally.
Okay. Steve Smart, good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Let's turn to Sir Martin Sorrell, the Chief Executive of the world's largest advertising company, WPP, joins us from central London, as you see. Sir Martin, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Colin.
Can we start with corporation tax? How low should it go in the UK?
Well, it's been effectively low. It's been attractive to foreign investors and foreign companies, being one of the lowest, if not the lowest, of the European states, and worldwide would be or continued policy along those lines would be very helpful. Whether it's 15% or 20% at the end of the day, I don't think makes too much difference as long as it's competitively effective. So it really depends on what relative rates are elsewhere. We've heard that Donald Trump, I think, has promised to reduce corporate tax rates to 15%. So the marker seems to be around that level.
Do you swallow the argument that if corporation tax gives companies more money to play with, one thing they might do with that cash is create a situation where productivity increases? You know, this endless problem that seems to bedevil Britain's economy of low productivity. Might corporation tax free enough cash so we can cure that ill?
Well, I don't think that's the key issue. My own view is companies, and we see this around the world, it's not just a UK phenomenon or European phenomenon, but it's everywhere. Companies are extremely short-term in their thinking. In fact, if you look at the S&P 500, effectively over the last year or so, it's been shrinking. So companies have been paying back in dividends and buybacks more than they've been earning. So they've been abrogating responsibility for reinvesting their retained earnings to external or their shareholding institutions. That's the problem, Colin. So corporation tax rates are part of it, but what I think is the fundamental point is getting companies to focus on the long term. We at WPP have been in business for 31 years. We're really interested, because of the nature of our business, in long-term brand building, and companies that innovate and invest are the companies that end up being valued in terms of brand valuation at the highest levels. In fact, if you and I invested in the top 10 brands that we value every year for the last 10 years, we'd outperform every investing index in the world. So the key issue, obviously tax rates play a part, but the key issue is to get companies to focus on the long term. To do that, you have to eliminate uncertainty. And of course, things around Brexit, things around Trump, Donald Trump, and the US don't help that.
No,
what we saw in France over the weekend will create further uncertainty. So that uncertainty is the enemy of growth, the enemy of investment.
No, we'll come on to Brexit and Trump and all that stuff in just a moment. But in terms of looking to the long term, is the long-term interest well served by having people in a boardroom, a company boardroom, who perhaps don't necessarily subscribe to some of the groupthink that maybe goes on there? You know far better than I do, obviously. I'm coming to this idea of to what extent employees play an active role, and whether you write that, you know, as a statutory right for employees to actually be there contributing, as Theresa May initially perhaps suggested they might be, or perhaps whether that serves no useful purpose if you're the boss of a big company.
Well, I think we overcomplicate this sort of stakeholder theory. If you're in business for the long term, if you're in building brands for the long term, so it goes back to the earlier point, you will do everything you can to attract all of the stakeholders. So this whole debate about whether you should have employee representation or not, at the end of the day, any company that's there for the long term will do everything it can to make sure its consumers are satisfied, that the people who work inside the business are satisfied, the government's satisfied, all of the stakeholders that you have to interact with. If you're in business for the long term, are critically important. So getting companies to think about the long term, about investing for the long term is critical. So the sort of things the Prime Minister was talking about this morning, R&D, infrastructure investment, are all very important in changing that. But there are some other things. I think in the tax area, for example, raising short-term capital gains tax, lowering long-term capital gains tax, both at a corporate and personal level, would, for example, change the dynamic in terms or the time frame of how people think about it. But as far as employee representation is concerned, if you're in business for the long term, you'll do things that are in the interest of the people inside the business as well as outside.
Turning to Brexit then, you mentioned Brexit. What's it doing? What is the fear of Brexit, I'm assuming it is fear, doing to advertising spending within your industry? Because, you know, when we look at some of the metrics, employment's doing well, growth's doing well. Some of the Cassandra who said it was going to be apocalyptic have been proved wrong. What's your sense?
Well, I know that you in the media, Colin, like to have immediate responses to everything. These things are much more, if not long-term, medium-term. So it's far too early to come to a conclusion, but I would say that generally Brexit and all the issues surrounding the government's policy around Brexit has caused uncertainty. You've seen some media companies suffer, particularly traditional media companies. Our Group M, which is our media planning and buying unit, have said that for 2017, UK advertising will probably rise. But that rise will not come from traditional media, not from ITV, for example, or traditional print and traditional television or media, but from new media. Google and Facebook are represented here at the CBI conference, and they will benefit, subject to some of the issues of fake news and measurement that they face. But subject to that, the increase in advertising spend next year will not come from traditional media, it'll come from new digital media, which is already more than 50% of total media spending in the UK. Having said that, generally, the answer to your question is Brexit uncertainty and all the other uncertainties we have to deal with that's the enemy to growth, the enemy to investment. That creates the uncertainty that reduces or delays spending. So I think you will see an impact in the short to medium term on spending, not just of an advertising nature, but generally.
Okay, so Martin, we better leave it there. We're just getting some reverb, as I think the young people call it, on your microphone. But thanks very much indeed to Martin Sorrell joining us from central London.
Thank you very much.
Trade unions have accused the Prime Minister, Theresa May, of making nice speeches followed by broken promises. That's after she appeared to row back on plans to force companies to have employees directly on their boards in her speech to the CBI. Let's speak to Dave Moxon, the Deputy General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, TUC. Joins us now live via Skype from Glasgow. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Your reaction, first of all, to what you've heard from Mrs May. Do you think she's done a U-turn?
Well, it seems as if she has. We were told that the Tory party pre-Brexit and then post-Brexit were going to become the party of the worker. We understood Theresa May's commitment to be one which said that the expertise of workers, but also their interest in their futures, would be directly represented on company boards. She's not going to get that by asking people to do business as usual. She's only going to get that by insisting that they do. And that seems to be what she's saying she's now not going to do.
OK, so what difference does board or would board level representation make to the unions? It's reasonably common in Europe, I believe.
Indeed, it's reasonably common in Europe, and it often matches up with other things like the patient investment in companies, which Theresa May says that she's committed to. What it does is two things. The first thing it does is it gives workers and their trade unions a stake in the future of their company, the opportunity to influence the direction that it takes. But secondly, and fundamentally, it uses the skills and the abilities of people on the front line, of people who are actually making the goods and delivering the services to their best effect. So this is something which is bad for the economy, the development of companies, and it's bad for the security of workers. And we really need Theresa May to think again.
I suppose one of the arguments could be that it may cause logjams at the top. What would you say in response to that?
Well, in a sense, what Theresa May's been saying is that there's a problem at the top just now, that companies have become disconnected from the realities of how to deliver, how to do business, how to plan their futures, and that some countries in Europe do better than that. So in a sense, what we're talking about here is trying to clear a logjam of bad governance and replace it with something which, as you say, is very common across the world, but something that hitherto UK industry has been very, very slow to react to.
So any concerns about belligerence would be misplaced?
I think belligerence, normal trade union relations will take place in companies, irrespective of whether boards have a trade union or worker representation on them. It's our job to represent our workers. It's the job of companies and directors to take companies in the best direction that they think possible. What we're talking about here is potential mechanisms that can alleviate some of the inevitable conflict that comes up in workplaces and give workers a real stake in their own future. And I think that's a win-win situation and a real miss if indeed Theresa May's words today come to pass.
So what are the repercussions for your members? I mean, what, if anything, can you do about it?
Well, it's very difficult to say what we can do in the face of a Tory government who have a majority and seem set in their ways. However, we will be holding the Theresa May and the government to their words about being on the side of the worker. They gave very clear undertakings prior to and post the EU referendum that workers' rights wouldn't be under attack, that workers would still have a strong place or have a stronger place in the UK economy. So we'll be casting this up. We'll be saying that the voter, the average person in the street, needs to look very carefully at what this government's programme is, and attempting to even at this stage, attempting them to solidify on their promise of proper worker representation on boards.
But presumably, there's always the method, the alternative of your members becoming shareholders and taking their voice to an AGM.
Well, obviously those two options exist. The difficulty is this: individual workers have a limited amount of power when they act as individuals, when they act as collectively as part of a trade union, when they act as part of a representative structure. Then that voice becomes meaningful. Now, if it's part of the government's narrative that that's a negative thing, then they shouldn't have made this promise in the first place. If, however, they take the view, as many European governments do, that collective voice, workers discussing amongst themselves what the best future is for them and what the best future is for the company, can actually play a positive role, then they'll deliver on that. Employers have a lot of power. Many of the things that the Conservative government have done over recent years have attempted to take away that power, and we'll be resisting very strongly any attempts to further dilute that, when what we desperately need is a collective voice in the workplace.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on Sky News. Thank you. Not be represented on boards, despite, it would appear, a categoric promise from the Prime Minister just last month.
Well, we are concerned that Theresa May does look like she might be rowing back on her plans. She made a very clear promise, both when she was asking to be the Conservative candidate for Prime Minister and last month at the Conservative Party conference, that workers would be represented on company boards. It's not entirely clear what she said today, but we think there's a couple of tests for whether she actually keeps that promise. First is, will workers be able to represent themselves directly in the boardroom? Second, will this be mandatory for companies? We know this is a good idea, it's helpful for business, it might promote the long-term success of the company, but it's not something that companies are going to do on their own. So we do want a legislative requirement.
Why is it helpful? Why is it a good idea?
Well, we know that workers often have the long-term interests of their company at heart, and also we know that they are often the people who know what's going on the shop floor. So relationships with suppliers, for example, how new technology might be actually working out in the company, and really kind of being able to bring the voice of what's actually going on within the company to the boardroom and really represent that.
But any successful company does that anyway, doesn't it? It asks its employees what the situation is. It doesn't necessarily need to have them on the board, does it?
Well, we think workers can speak for themselves, really. many successful companies do find ways to consult their employees, and we think that, you know, this is a good way to do it. It's a way that's used in successful economies all across Europe, economies like Germany, like Sweden, most major European economies do this. We think it's a sensible route to business success and one that the UK should be adopting.
And what about concerns that some union representatives could be somewhat belligerent and actually stop the successful or satisfactory working of a company?
Well, those aren't concerns that I've heard, and they're certainly not concerns that come across in areas where this happens at the moment. The company First Group actually has an employee representative on their board, have had since they were formed in 1989, and they're a union member, and both management and that representative speak very highly of the cooperation that's formed. In Sweden and in Germany, you often see unions sponsoring the worker representative, and a very successful relationship. I think the head of Rolls-Royce was speaking recently about how that works in Germany and how it could successfully work in the UK.
Kate, we were making the point, so when we were speaking to one of your colleagues, actually a representative from the TUC in Scotland in the last hour, maybe the hour before that, they all blend into one. And he was telling, I was asking him about the fact that you could be a shareholder, just have one share really, and then go to the AGM and still get your voice heard that way.
Absolutely, and trade unions often do hold shares in company and represent them through that way. But we do think it's just a basic matter of fairness that workers who often are most affected by the decision that company makes should have their voices represented in those boardroom discussions.
Okay, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks a lot.